say a few words about the Center for Turkish Studies, which is the organization that made this event possible. The Center for Turkish Studies aims to promote an open forum through expert opinions and debates, focusing on the politics, economics, society and culture of Turkey and the region, as well as the relations between Turkey and the UK. Through its various events and policies, and by creating a dialogue between individuals in Turkey and the UK, it aims to build a bridge between the two countries and their peoples. As you all know, our speaker for this occasion is Dr. Jenny White, and it's my great pleasure to introduce her this evening. A writer and social anthropologist, Jenny White is currently a distinguished visiting professor at the Institute for Turkish Studies at Stockholm University and a professor in anthropology at Boston University. She is the former president of the Turkish Studies Association and of the American Anthropological Association Middle East section, and sits on the board of the Institute of Turkish Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. White has received numerous grants and fellowship from, among others, the Social Science Research Council, the MacArthur Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and Fulbright Hays. Dr. White has written extensively on Turkey, Turks in Germany, and on topics ranging from political Islam and nationalism to ethnic identity and gender issues. She is the author of various books, including Money Makes Us Relatives, Women's Labor in Urban Turkey, and Islamist Mobilization in Turkey, a study in vernacular politics. Dr. Jenny White is also the author of 3 novels, which take place in Turkey: The Sultan's Seal, which came out in 2006, The Abyssinian Proof, 2008, and The Winter Thief, 2010. This evening, Jenny White will discuss how and why the Turkish democracy is at a tipping point through the subject of her new book that came out in 2012, Muslim Nationalism and the New Turks. Foreign Policy has chosen the book as one of the 3 best books on the Middle East in the year 2012. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenny White.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. This is a great honor to be in this hallowed hall here. And thank you to the Center for Turkish Studies for bringing me here, all the way from Stockholm. I want to, well, I usually speak standing up, but I will try to do this sitting down. Can't see everyone. So I want to begin by setting today's, I'm sure a lot of you are just interested in today's current events. So I want to use the opportunity to set those in a larger context by giving you some background to Turkey's transformation over the last 30 years from the perspective of national identity and democracy, which is also the subject of my book. But obviously I only have half an hour, so I'm only going to do a very small piece of that. So what was Turkey changing from? I'm going to talk about the Kemalist paradigm that characterized most of the 20th century. Although now dethroned, elements of it still powerfully shape social and political life today. What did Turkey change to? I'm going to talk about the rise of an Islamic bourgeoisie and the Islam-rooted Justice and Development Party, the AKP, that won elections in 2002 and has stayed in power ever since with an ever-increasing share of the vote under the leadership of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan. Finally, what should we make of the Gezi protests this past summer and Prime Minister Erdogan's recent autocratic turn? Turkey is right now at a tipping point, a time when something substantially different is shaping up. Something important has shifted, but nobody is sure which way it's going to go. And I want to set out that balancing act for you. Until recently, Turkey was doing extremely well. Its GDP growth rivaled China, its banks were solid, it was the 17th largest economy in the world. It was arguably more democratic, more prosperous, and politically influential than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. As part of the EU accession process, Turkey changed hundreds of laws and institutions to align them with Europe. It's been writing a constitution to replace the one written under military oversight after the 1980 coup. Its interventionist army has been placed under civilian control. And in 2011, the New York Times readers chose Istanbul as the place they would most like to visit in the world. So, despite all of this feel-good glitz, Turkey has actually been engulfed in internal strife since long before Gezi. In fact, it's one of the things that led me to write this particular book. It's like, what is going on? There was a remarkable amount of polarization, almost a toxic tribalism that was splitting apart family and friends, I'd say at least over the past decade, and it was getting worse and worse. Certain issues were flashpoints that could cause a conversation to explode, particularly mention of the headscarf. You were either for it or against it. So on the surface, Turkish society appears mainly divided into militantly opposed secular and Islamic forces. These, at least, are the terms in which the polarization has usually been talked about. I think that the tension arises not from secular Islamic differences, and I say this because people assigned to these groups are actually more alike than they acknowledge, and I'll get back to that, especially the younger generation that makes up half the country. So, I believe that the tension and fear come from a radical revision of the most basic category of all. What does it mean to be Turkish? To be a member of this nation? Popular answers have been naturalized through decades of Kemalist Republican education. We are a Turkish race. We are of Turkish blood, of Muslim faith. Our historical roots lie in Turkic Central Asia. We believe in our founder Ataturk's project of modernization. We are laicist. Laicism has always been wrongly translated as secularism. It is not secularism. Laicism in Turkey is a secular lifestyle within a system of state-sponsored Sunni Islam. It is state control over religion. It is not a separation of state and religion. Can we have the first slide, please? You know who this guy is. Kemalism refers to the vision of Turkey's founding figure and first president, Mustafa Kemal, who was later given the honorific Ataturk, meaning father or ancestor of the Turks. He envisioned a culturally unitary, westernized, secular society, which in practice meant the repression of all ethnic and religious identities beyond Turkish and Sunni. Could I have the next? He also instituted a comprehensive top-down program of social engineering. This is from the early Republic. There was a new alphabet. There was new laws about clothing. And these were this is one of the posters that were sent out to try to convince people. The new writing is easier than the old writing. In the old time, you could have 3 wives. Now you can have 2. This is a big revolution. So many, many, many things were changed in this manner. After Ataturk's death, the state took on a tutelary role as guarantor of Kemalist democracy and national unity and solidarity. In effect, this created a fault line between state institutions, including the military and the judicial system, and elected governments, which by definition represented diverse constituencies, some of them quite pious. Next. This resulted in 3 coups and numerous other interventions in the political process by the military and the courts against political parties and governments accused of undermining national unity. The Kemalist vision of the nation imagined solidarity as unity of blood and soy or lineage, in which being Muslim is considered to be an essential component of having Turkish blood. So here are children at a sort of national celebration, Youth Day, wearing Ataturk masks, wearing the mask of their ancestor. So what we're talking about, so being Muslim is considered to be an essential component of having Turkish blood. So that doesn't mean Islam is faith. This is quite different. It's a religio-racial definition of identity. So what this means is that you can be secularist, never go to a mosque, but still consider being Muslim a crucial part of your identity as a Turk. Non-Muslims, of course, are then in an odd situation. They could be citizens, but they cannot be Turks. And as such, because they are not of Turkish blood, they were considered for a long time to be potentially disloyal. The nation is perceived to be continually under threat by, quote, outside and inside enemies. I used to hear these terms all the time. I was like, why is everyone using these odd terms? And it turns out that these are taught in school. It was odd to hear Prime Minister Erdogan, who has largely overturned the Kemalist paradigm, using those very terms to describe the Gezi protesters this summer. Outside enemies are the countries that divided up the Ottoman Empire with the Treaty of Sèvres after World War I. Europe, Russia, now you can add the US. Prime Minister Erdogan has added a few more figures recently. Inside enemies are Turkey's non-Muslim citizens suspected of being cat's paws for outsiders. The Kurds also have been viewed as inside enemies as well, manipulated by foreigners. In school books and a variety of rituals from grade school to adulthood, Turks learn to be militant, they learn who their enemies are, and they learn to be suspicious of non-conforming others. There's also an obsessive focus on maintaining the purity of the Turkish lineage, or the soy. So a couple of years ago, for instance, there was a ban on assisted reproduction using sperm banks. And the debate in the media was about, well, is this something Islamic, or is this to protect the lineage of the nation? And there was some other, the refusal to accept Greek blood donations during the earthquake in 1999, and other similar things that all have to do with protecting the purity of this bloodline. Next, please. The purity and impenetrability of the nation's boundaries and the honor of the nation are all talked about in the same language as women's sexual purity and family honor. This is a bunker in a place called Aktütün, where quite a large number of soldiers were killed in an attack by the PKK, and the Milliyet newspaper photographed the scene at this outpost, and one of them got my attention. This is a soldier who, in front of his bunker, wrote out in stones, the order is honor. So what this means is that popular patriarchal ideas about family, about sex, and about women's place are mirrored upwards from the family to the community to the nation and continually reinforce one another. Community for the Kemalists is a product of a sense of continual threat, and a strong state and military are presented as crucial guarantors of the health and safety of the national family. So what has changed? The recent polarization is in part a consequence of the vacuum created by the weakening of the state Kemalist project over recent years, and the increasing inability of the state to control the definition of Turkishness and thereby shape the identity of Turkish youth. Just over half of Turkey's population is under 30. Young people are increasingly expressing themselves through new media, civic activism, consumerism. Polls show that young people in Turkey have a much more heterogeneous identities, composed of seemingly contradictory positions and affiliations. Individualism in Turkey, however, continues to be framed within a collective logic. Young people are searching for arenas of belonging, of which the nation now is just one. used to be the only one. But belonging to a group, whether a family, community, or nation, or even a soccer club, continues in Turkey to be essential for social survival as well as for social identity. The political scientist Soli Özel told me that in Turkey it's too dangerous to be an individual because you do not have impartial state institutions that you can count on to protect your rights. So you need a group to do that. He told me a saying. He said, if you leave the herd, you're eaten by wolves. Since the 1980s, Muslim networks have developed that are quite different from traditional Islamic movements and brotherhoods. And they are the beneficiaries of this search for alternate collectivities. Against Kemalism's message of continual embattlement, Islam appeals to youth with its rootedness and its networks that promise to help them gain education, skills, and connections needed to succeed economically, and that give meaning to individual lives within a distinctly Muslim brand of national community. This is especially true for the dense political and economic networks surrounding the Gülen movement, or Hizmet movement, and the patronage networks of the AKP. Until recently, these two worked in tandem. Hizmet is organized as separate foundations that have this worldwide reach and that are primarily involved in education, business, and charity. So, can you move that a little bit so we can see the logo? What it says. So this is a billboard in Istanbul, in a suburb of Istanbul. And it says, come on kids, pray in the mosque, collect points and grab your prize. So there is piety and profit. You can think of that as the motto of these new Muslim networks. And it also is choice, to choose your prize. AKP is a moderate offspring of a series of earlier, more radically Islamist parties under Newington and Erbakan. Although led by openly pious politicians, AKP claims not to be Islamic, but rather a center-right conservative party that served a broad and varied constituency across Turkey. What distinguished AKP from its Islamist predecessors is that it had moved away from ideology, from Islam as the lens through which you make policy, toward something that early on in the administration, the AKP administration, was called the Muslimhood model. And there was actually a whole theology of secularism that was developed around this that I studied at the time. What this means is that they posit that if you're a Muslim and you enter the public sphere, let's say you're elected to an office, the fact that you enter the public sphere does not make you an Islamist. Why should it? Right? If you're a pious Christian, you get elected to parliament, that doesn't make you a Christianist or something like that. I mean, so their point is that Muslimhood is a personal attribute. It's something that you take with you into your office, but you don't make policy based on that, based on Islam. You make policy based on pragmatic considerations, which sounds good, except that you can also consider power and profit as those pragmatic considerations. So the idea of pious Muslims running a secular system is not a contradiction. And when Prime Minister, I said that nobody uses the Muslimhood model terminology anymore, but when Prime Minister Erdogan went to Cairo in 2008, he was met at the airport by the Muslim Brotherhood, who greeted him like this rock star. It's like, oh, we love Turkey, we want to be an Islamic democracy just like you. So in his first speech, Erdogan said, by the way, you made a mistake. We're not an Islamic democracy. We are a secular democracy run by pious Muslims, and we highly recommend this. This annoyed the Muslim Brotherhood to no end, and they started vilifying Turkish Islam, saying they're not really Turks after all, I mean, not really Muslims after all. And Erdogan repeated this message at each, I think he went to Libya and Tunisia as well, and he repeated that message. That is the Muslimhood model. In the mid-1980s, the Prime Minister at the time, Turgut Özal, opened Turkey's economy to the world market. This unleashed entrepreneurs in the provinces who tended to be pious, and it led to the rise of an Islamic bourgeoisie with economic and political power. Under the AKP, they have developed an alternative definition of the nation and the national subject based on a post-Ottoman rather than a republican model. And they have largely overturned the Kemalist republican framework. This has allowed the new pious elites the freedom to experiment with expressions of Muslimhood and national identity that would not have been possible before. So Muslim nationalism is based on a cultural Turkism rather than blood-based Turkish ethnicity. And it imagines the nation based on much more flexible post-imperial post-Ottoman boundaries rather than the historically embattled World War I republican borders. The founding moment for Muslim nationalists is not 1923. It is 1453 with the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks. So that is now, this is a tile picture in the Taksim metro station in Istanbul, which is the epicenter. Taksim is the epicenter of the secular nightlife. So it's interesting that you have the little Christians lined up under arrest, the Sultan coming in. So this has become a huge thing that's reenacted. It's visually depicted in public places. It's commemorated in new national festivities that I'm sure not accidentally displace Kemalist national rituals like the one with the youth ritual we saw before. This creates quite a different understanding of Turkish national interests. That's why this is important. It allows Muslim nationalists to reach out to Turkey's non-Muslim minorities and to open borders to Arab states, make global alliances, and pursue economic and political interests without concern for the ethnic identity of its interlocutors or the role that they played in Republican history, with former enemies, Greece and Armenia, for instance, or solving the Cyprus impasse, making a peace deal with the PKK, even discussing the Armenian genocide, all of which were formerly taboo in Turkey, but can now be discussed, and in many cases are acted upon. As new forms of nationalism emerge and identities and loyalties become contested, people struggle more than ever to maintain the physical and metaphorical boundaries that mark their territories of belonging. Who am I? Who is with me and who is against me? Next. It's not so much Islam that has challenged the status quo, but rather what Islam has become in this urban, modern, globalized environment where for many, religious and national identities, like commodities, have become objects of choice. You can choose how to be Muslim. You can choose what kind of Turk you are. Islam is faith, but it's also a lifestyle choice now, with its own fashion, leisure, musical performance, media, and publishing realms that in many ways mirror secular society. And there's this enormous convergence in lifestyles and expectations, especially among young people. This is a Turkish version of Vogue. So religion has been secularized. It's an object of choice. And pious Muslims come up to me constantly and say, I am a shmulu Muslim. I am a choosing Muslim. You know, I've chosen to be a Muslim in a particular way, and that is what makes this modern. That is what makes this valuable, unlike those people over there who veil because it's tradition. So the Muslim identity becomes valuable and modern because it's chosen. Then it is remixed with other identities, with social class, with national identity, and so on. You'll see a lot of masks. This is an AKP Youth Congress where they're wearing Tayyip Erdogan masks. The danger to Turkey lies not so much in a resurgence of Islamic ideology. I think that has been jettisoned for a privatized, secularized Muslimhood. Instead, Turkey's democracy is being undermined by old habits of power. Strongman autocracy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and intolerance of difference. Turkey has more journalists in jail than China or Iran. It ranks near the bottom of international indicators on the status of women. Despite all these recent changes, Turkey remains a society characterized by powerful group identities modeled on the autocratic patriarchal family. That is mirrored in social and political relations and in Turkish nationalism. The effect is heightened by a majoritarian understanding of democracy, in which the electoral winners, having obtained a majority, get to determine what is allowed and what is banned in social life according to the norms of their communities, with no room for tolerance of non-conforming practices. And I say that whether I'm talking about banning alcohol or banning the headscarf. These are old problems. After several years of experimenting with liberal conservatism, the AKP has snapped like a rubber band back to the Turkish status quo. The power of the military to interfere in politics has been reduced. Hundreds of officers have been tried, accused of plotting coups. Some have received life sentences. Formerly Kemalist state cadres have been infiltrated with partisans of the government. Well, this has closed the rift between the state and the elected government, but it also reproduces the problem of lack of impartiality. They're just different people in these chairs now. Next. This past summer, in response to the government's announcement that, this is Guy Fawkes, these are from the Gezi protests, with a mask. This past summer, in response to the government's announcement that Gezi Park, one of the last green spaces in central Istanbul, was about to be turned into a mall, several dozen young activists began a peaceful sit-in to save the park. The protest was violently put down by the police, but instead of fading away, the response was a spontaneous, countrywide, mass series of protests. 6 protesters died, thousands were injured, many more are about to be tried under draconian terrorism laws. The Gezi youth are the product of these enormous changes in Turkish society since 1980. They are global, playful, consumerist. Turkishness is a personal attribute, just as AKP suggested that Muslimhood was a personal attribute. They represent themselves, not an ideological position, a political party, or a scheming foreign power. It is the first time in Turkish history that such masses of people, many of them with contradictory or competing interests, have come together without any ideological party or organization. Ideology or party organization. They cross class boundaries, they bridge left and right, conservative, liberal, pious, secular, Turk, Kurd. In fact, a recent poll actually then now verified that by finding that the participants in the Gezi protests across the nation, the attributes of the protesters reflected pretty accurately the distribution of those characteristics in the population as a whole. What this means is a sizable new constituency has emerged, as yet with no name, no platform, and no leader. But what has happened is that the protests have reframed the debates in Turkey, and in some cases abroad, away from Islamism, secularism, as an explanatory framework, because it's hard to keep that up when you look at the actual what was going on the ground in Gezi. Instead, it has put the focus on government responsibility, transparency, shared rights, and tolerance of difference. They have revealed a mass discontent with the paternalism that has characterized relations between society and the state and government throughout the 20th century. The Prime Minister responded by severely compromising freedom of speech and civic action with new regulations. He removed thousands of police officers and prosecutors from their posts in order to derail serious corruption cases brought against senior members of his party. In effect, Prime Minister Erdogan has revived the Kemalist threat paradigm with a new cast of characters accusing the Hizmet movement of being the enemy within, of having taken over state institutions that are now moving against him in what he calls an attempted coup just before the March national local elections. And also we have an enemy without, because they're supposedly doing this at the behest of the US government. The Prime Minister's really paranoia and go-it-alone aggressiveness have undermined his own hard-won victories, like the PKK peace deal and the now spooked economy. The corruption cases have led to resignations of a number of ministers and others, and I would not be at all surprised if there were a number of defections from the AKP. The problem is that if you defect from the AKP, you have nowhere else to go. Nevertheless, the AKP is still expected to do well in the March local elections, in part because of these weak alternatives, but also because the Prime Minister's polarizing message works. Much of the country remains in thrall to the familiar symbiosis of traditional family values and the state. When Prime Minister Erdogan invoked the Kemalist threat paradigm that the protests were led by shadowy outsiders working together with internal enemies, many responded, as they always have, by calling for the autocratic father to protect the family from penetration by outsiders, by marginals, by those seeking to undermine the Turkish national family's honor. And you see that language used in Prime Minister Erdogan's speech and in other AKP language. The Gezi protests have heralded important steps in Turkey's transformation away from 20th century values and incomplete political structures toward a more tolerant democratic order and a civic nationalism where inclusion is based on citizenship rather than blood or group membership. But the traditional family retains a powerful hold on the national imagination, and through that, on a political system dominated by older males. Turkey is at a tipping point, held in the balance, almost 50-50 if you look at the polls, between those seeking to loosen the reins and those unsettled by the chaos of liberalism and desiring order. Just at the moment of greatest possibility of moving democracy forward, the balance in Turkey is being tipped back toward autocracy by men wedded to power and fortune, who appear willing to jettison a decade of much heralded democratic reforms in order to maintain their hold. And I want to not end on this negative note. Next slide, please. How many of you know what Gangnam Style is? So anyway, this is Psy. This is an audience in Istanbul watching a performance by Psy, a South Korean pop star whose video, Gangnam Style, was this worldwide sensation. And if you have seen the video, you will know that it's a very revealing. There are some Asian women in very skimpy clothing doing very sexy dance moves behind Psy, who's also doing very sexy dance moves, including a horsey dance. So my point in showing this is that this is the other 50%, and it includes both pious and secular people. These are people who came to watch Psy. This is a picture from Newington, who did a kind of pictorial of the audience. And they're all in there, some with headscarves, some without, wearing the big blue glasses and watching something that, you would think you would not be watched by if you believe the secular Islamic divide. But in fact, there are many such scenes happening in Turkey all the time, not just in Istanbul. This is the younger generation, and it crosses all of those boundaries, and this is where the hope lies. But I don't know which way it's going to go. So, thank you.